One of the great gifts of my job is I get to hear a lot of stories. I get to hear stories of women, of congregations, stories of calling. I also hear stories of hardship and marginalization, which sometimes turn into stories of courage. The stories I hear are stories of hope deferred and hope fulfilled. And so this morning, I want us to take a look at a biblical story which is not all that unlike the stories that I hear every day. And so I want to introduce you to 5 of who I think are among the most influential women in all of the Bible. Machlah, Hoglah, Milcah, Tirzah, and Noah, also known as the daughters of Zelophehad. Now, I know you've heard their story a million times, but because it's so good, maybe we could think about it just this one more time. So their story is found in Numbers 27, as we just heard read, and huge thanks to Sandy and Jillian for reading that passage, which I know had a lot of difficult names, so thank you all for doing that. But even before we get to their story, we actually hear their names for the first time in Numbers 26, just a chapter before, in the census. So the census is going tribe by tribe, clan by clan, this father had this son, and so on, in order to count the number of men who are actually going to get to enter into the promised land. And then all of a sudden we have this kind of change in the pattern when it says there's this one man who had no sons, only these 5 daughters. So even before we get to their story, we probably could imagine a few things about their lives simply by the fact they're included in the census. This census in Numbers 26 is including the people who were not among the previous generation who were punished to die out because they didn't trust God whenever the spies went into the promised land. These are the people who were born into the harsh desert reality of the wilderness. They've never had a settled home or domesticated agricultural system to rely on. They had to count on the desert for their sustenance, as well as the manna and quail which God provided, but which they often complained about. And so as tough as life was for the Israelites in the wilderness, we have to imagine that it was even more difficult for the women. It was their job to figure out how to take care of their families, how to feed them. They would have to pack up the tents when they were on the move. If there were ever any animals to ride on, the women probably weren't afforded that opportunity. And like most depictions of ancient Israelite society, this was a patriarchal society, meaning the women had to rely on the men for their security, provision, protection. They lived with this hope that the man that they were connected to was going to receive an allotment of land and this promise that God had given them. And when they got that land, they were going to finally have that settled home that was going to give them the peace and security that they longed for. And so for these 5 women, we know that the man they relied on was their father, Zelophehad, because that's who we hear them described in relation to. We don't hear any names of any husbands, so we assume that they were not married. So even before we ever hear their story, we could know these 2 things to be true about our 5 heroines. 1, their lives were not easy. And 2, all of their hope and security was tied to their father. So as their story begins in Numbers 27, we hear after this long introduction of who they are, that they have come forward to stand before Moses and Eleazar and all the leaders at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And so in the Israelite camp, the tent of meeting would have been sitting right in the center of it. So I imagine these women kind of working their way through the crowds, right, to reach this middle point and stand there before their highest leaders, before Moses, and before, it says, the entire assembly, which in the Old Testament is really just another way of saying all of the Israelites. Now, if we think that's not a lot of people, we actually know how many it was because we just heard the census and it counted them up. And so we have 601,730 men, plus 23,000 Levites, plus the women and children. And so they stand there before maybe millions of people. Talk about the boldness that it took to do this. Not to mention, if you happen to be reading Numbers as a straight narrative all the way through, then you would have seen that just 2 chapters before this, the last woman who stood at the entrance to the tent of meeting wound up getting impaled by a spear. This was not some everyday kind of action to take. It took some bravery. So the first words that they say when they get there are, "Our father died in the wilderness." And we find out what motivated them to do this courageous thing. Their father has died. And in addition to the grief that I'm sure that they felt in losing a parent, grief that's probably all too familiar to many of us these days. For them, in addition to that grief of losing someone they love, when their father died, they've not only lost a parent, but they have lost all of their hope. Without the protection of a man, they would just be left on their own to live in extreme poverty, probably passed from family to family, treated who knows how, or maybe even just left in the wilderness to die. And somehow, in the midst of this grief and hopelessness, they come up with this plan of going before Moses. I love going, they go together. They don't just send one representative, but they go together and they stand there and they say, "Our father died in the wilderness. He wasn't among Korah's followers who banded together against the Lord." That's their way of saying he wasn't among some other people who needed to be punished. He was one of the good guys. "He died for his own sin and left no son. So why should our father's name disappear simply because he had no son?" And then they say, "Give us land among our father's relatives." These women ask to be given land, something that had never happened in the biblical text before this. And so the case they make is about their father's legacy, that in order for his name to live on, he needed to have some land that was connected to him. It was kind of a way of thinking about an afterlife in the Old Testament. And so that they present this case about his name living on. And some of our interpreters have doubted this. And so they come in and say, "Oh, you know, Zelophehad's daughters, they were just using this bit about their father's name because they were greedy and they wanted to get the land for themselves." But we have no indication of that in the passage. As a matter of fact, when we see how God responds to their request, I think we can be assured that their intentions were pure, because whenever Moses takes their question before God, God responds to Moses and says, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them an inheritance with their father's relatives." God says the women are right. They were right to come asking for land for what should belong to them. So Moses, you take care of it, you give it to them. They are right. The trajectory of the story for these 5 women was set the moment that their father died. They were destined to live in poverty, to pray that they could get married so they wouldn't be abused or just left to die. Theirs was a story of hardship and marginalization. But they changed it. They changed it because they dared to speak up and turn their story from one destined for hardship into one of hope for a new life. But that's not even the best part. Because when God responds to their request, God doesn't just stop by saying, "They're right, give them the land." God continues and tells Moses, "You say to all the Israelites, if another man dies and leaves no sons, you give his land to his daughter too. If he has no daughters, to his brothers, relatives, so forth. This is to have the force of law for the Israelites as the Lord commanded Moses." God responds to a situation of suffering and says, we need a new framework so that this doesn't happen again. The law wasn't fixed. God uses the law as a way to respond to suffering, not to inflict it. And so a new law is created so that no one would wind up in this situation again. Because there is power in the bravery to speak up. Surely this had happened before, right? Surely some other father had died, leaving only daughters and no sons, but No one said anything about it. They were content to just pass on by and let those stories reach their tragic end. But these 5 seemingly lowly, insignificant, unprotected women, they did dare to speak up. They took action. And in doing so, they were able to transform stories of hope deferred into stories of hope fulfilled. And so for us today, I imagine that we all could agree that there are far too many stories of hopelessness like this still present in our world. Stories of injustice, stories of suffering, of oppression, stories of people in hardship being marginalized, stories of people living in disadvantaged and seemingly incurable situations. And maybe those are our stories. The stories of grief and hopelessness that we live out each day. But maybe they're the stories of others. Stories of people who we love, or maybe even just people who we pass by, who have to live the realities of systemic injustice that are present all around us. And so the question for us is, can we become like Maklah, Hoglah, Milcah, Tirzah, and Noah? Whether it be out of our own pain or out of the suffering of others, can we be the people who speak up and transform those stories of hope deferred into hope fulfilled? Can we become daughters of Zelophehad? Because if a daughter of Zelophehad is someone who does speak up, who refuses to let suffering win and stories of oppression play out in endless cycles, then I think there are daughters of Zelophehad all among us. For example, Tarana Burke. Tarana Burke is the first person to use the phrase "Me Too" in order to bring awareness to women's experiences of sexual assault, harassment, and misconduct. For her, out of her own pain, out of her own experience of rape and assault, she found the courage to speak up and to encourage others to do the same, so that the very systems in place that allowed such atrocities to happen in the first place no longer had to exist but could be dismantled. And so Tarana Burke is a daughter of Zelophehad. Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza are the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. In the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin, these 3 women co-founded this movement as a way of addressing the fact that they were no longer going to walk on by their communities as they saw the disproportionate murder of Black people. And so in doing so, they have addressed the critical need for racial justice and equity in our society. And so Opal Tometi, Patrisse Cullors, and Alicia Garza are daughters of Zelophehad as well. And even though these examples that I've just given are all of women, you don't have to be a woman to be a daughter of Zelophehad, because theirs is the work of all God's people. So what will it look like for us to become like Patrisse and Opal and Alicia, Tarana, Maklah, Hoglah, Milcah, Tirzah, and Noah? The story of the daughters of Zelophehad compels us to speak up, to take action, to participate in God's work for redemption and justice in this world through Jesus Christ, so that suffering no longer wins, so that we change stories of endless cycles of hopelessness, so that we can become the ones who might get to join in that sacred work of changing the stories of hope deferred into hope fulfilled. So may the Almighty God grant us the courage that it might be said of us, we are the daughters of Zelophehad. Amen.